Hi everyone, and welcome to this presentation titled "The Kitchen Table is Dead, at least in Canadian National Sport Organization Archetypes." I'm Milena M from the University of Ottawa, and I'm presenting on behalf of my research team, which is composed of Thompson, Marijke Taks, Erik Lachance, Hoye, Naraine, and Benoît Séguin. So in the past, organization theorists have used archetypes to understand, compare and contrast organizations on what we would now consider governance principles like performance. This was the case in sport with Kikulis, Slack, and Heining's NSO archetypes based on Canadian NSOs, as you can see on the slide, where they had determined three archetypes: the kitchen table, the boardroom, and the executive office. These were determined based on orientation, domain, principles of organization, criteria of effectiveness, and also on their organizational structure or complexity. But today, there have been a lot of changes in terms of governance and capacity, and a lot of challenges in this respect. There are more expectations in this respect, as well as more stakeholders to manage. These stakeholders also expect to look for credible self-governance. They also have expectations in terms of ethical leadership and maintaining trust. And on top of that, the NSOs and other sport organizations have to continue working to retain existing members and to grow their sport, to get new members. But also, probably one of the most glaring differences between when Kikulis, Slack, and Heinings did their work to today are all the new legal and technological advancements and requirements that managers have to deal with today. So more recently, there have been researchers and different research groups who have looked at various governance aspects. Most of them, though, have focused on measuring or identifying these principles, namely performance, accountability, transparency, and stakeholder participation, as well as board composition and capacity. However, with all these different studies, what we do notice is quite a few measurement issues and also a lot of differing opinions. So some issues with coherence and consistency in terms of what the true or real or universal governance principles should be and how do we measure them. So you're going to ask me, so what? Well, we do need to understand these changes that have been happening. We have to look at the governance principles. So it's time to move beyond just describing where organizations are at with their different governance principles, but now moving into what they're doing and how they're doing it, and what does that mean in terms of their performance. So we integrated the different governance principles that the various studies have identified in the last few years into an archetype analysis of Canadian national sport organizations, same population as Kikulis, Slack, and Heinings did or used, so that we could determine what archetypes are found today. Are they the same? Are they different? Is there a combination of? And also, what does that mean? What are the implications for researchers and for practitioners of these same or new archetypes? So we did a what would be called a mixed methods approach. We started with a landscape survey of Canadian Sport Canada funded NSOs, the same population that Kikulis, Slack, and Heinings used, and we asked them basic governance and capacity questions covering the different principles identified in previous research. We followed this up with more in-depth interviews, 45 interviews of 22 NSOs. We did want to ensure we covered small all the way to extra large NSOs, which we did have. So our sample, their budgets range from 140,000 Canadian to 24 million Canadian. Their number of employees, paid employees, range from 0 to 58, so quite a big range. And also their number of board members ranged from 4 board members all the way to 15. So with all this information in terms of the landscape survey and the interviews, we then ran cluster analyses using SPSS. Now, it's important to understand that cluster analyses are open-ended by nature, which means that the researcher is the one to determine the number of groups and then SPSS will determine who fits where. So in order to get, we looked for the best fit. So we tried clusters of 3 groups, 4 groups, 5 groups, and 6 groups for each of the following analyses. So we tried purely just capacity based. We tried with the Kikulis et al. Variables. We tried just by the nature of the board, by funding sources, and by governance principles, as well as a combination of all of these. So what did we find? Well, just looking at the capacity issue, well, yes, we do have small to extra large capacity NSOs, but there's not much else that we could really glean from this analysis. So we moved on to the other ones. Looking at the governance analysis, actually most variables did provide good discrimination between groups, except for internal accountability, which didn't provide any difference. So this particular variable was excluded from future analysis. And then Kikulis et al.'s variables, we ran their, the cluster analysis. What's interesting is that the old values that used to be used in terms of sport participation or growth and high performance don't discriminate anymore between groups. They all have that. What did make a difference was whether they had the values of stakeholder engagement, of good governance, and or diversity. And probably the most interesting finding is that whether it was a group of 3, 4, 5, or 6, there was no longer this kitchen table archetype that we could identify. What the best fit was in terms of our governance analysis was a 4-group cluster using a combination of all the different variables, internal accountability accepted. And so we have, as you can see, 4 groups. The board-led is what we would be maybe your smallest NSO, executive-led, professional-led, all the way up to corporate. And so 4 groups was the best fit. Of particular note in terms of discrimination, you can see the values, how they change. There is similarity between the board to the professional-led in terms of the stakeholder engagement emphasis. And then the executive led to the corporate by having governance, stakeholder engagement, as well as diversity. But there are 4 actual variables that provided the largest differences between the groups. And so these were capacity, revenue sources, efficiency, and also, well, capacity is budget and personnel. Let me just, so there's actually 4, even though it shows up 3 here. And so when we went through and actually post hoc for some of the interviewed NSOs that did not fill out the survey, we actually went through an analysis and were able to classify all of them based on one of these 4 groups. And if there was ever a choice to be made because one NSO fell maybe equally between 2 groups, we looked at these, at the revenues, the personnel, the efficiency, and the budget, to be able to discriminate between whether it was one group or the other that was a better fit. And so you could really see that there is a difference. There's no more kitchen table. The board, for sure, the board-led is the smaller NSO, the lower capacity, closest to what would have been the kitchen table, but it has quite a high efficiency and actually does do quite a bit of good governance. So what does this mean? Well, the contemporary archetypes that we found provide researchers with greater understanding of the internal and external drivers of change. So whether it is capacity, legal requirements, or whatnot, we have a better understanding. We can have a better understanding using these archetypes. There's also the move from 3 archetypes to 4, from Kikulis et al. To today, as well as no more kitchen table per se. It's actually split between the board-led and the executive-led. And as I mentioned, there is some similarity between the first and the third, so board and professional, and the second and the fourth, so executive-led and corporate. So if we use the idea of organizational tracks for change, it's not a linear projection or progression. you can see actually that there is more similarities between 1 and 3 and 2 and 4. And so there is more work to be done in this respect as to how NSOs can grow or evolve or progress through these archetypes. One important point to mention out, unlike the Kikulis et al. Archetype that had perhaps a negative connotation sometimes with the kitchen table term, we don't find that here. And what we find actually is that even the small NSOs can do good governance. They can be highly efficient. They can be good at accountability and involving or having the stakeholders participate. So it is very important that that is now something that's quite different than what it used to be. So that means that size is no longer correlated to the values that NSOs place on governance, stakeholder relations, and diversity. So you can still be small and still do good, do well, and be interested in diversity and stakeholder relations, for example, and governance. So the main issue here is capacity constraints. So they can do, but it's how much can they do. They can govern well, and they're highly efficient. So what potentially is needed is for funders and national support agencies to be a bit more flexible in their guidelines and resources to understand the constraints, the particular constraints of the smaller NSOs, but to also understand that they are actually quite efficient, they're quite good. They can be quite good at governance, and so it's not because you're small that you can't do it. So in conclusion, the kitchen table archetype is no longer applicable, at least in Canadian NSO context. The small NSOs are now the board-led and the executive-led. Executive, if it wasn't clear before, is just either the CEO or the executive director who leads most of the work. The small NSOs can enact good governance principles. And in terms of researchers, using this kind of archetype approach can help us examine governance evolution and change over time. So it allows us to look at an ideal type. So because an archetype is ideal, not all NSOs, let's say in the board led, will fit exactly every single criteria. They may have some that look more like an executive or professional led, but overall they tend to be more like a board led, let's say. So you can see the ideal type. You can analyze the NSOs based on their ideal type. Sometimes if there are issues, maybe it's because they're schizoid between two different ones. And so at that point, that could be actually an indicator that something needs to be adjusted. And you can compare and contrast organizations much more holistically, because now with these 4 archetypes, we have governance considered as well as complexity and values and capacity and resource funding. So thank you for listening to this presentation. I want to thank the study's funders, the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, as well as Sport Canada. And if you have any questions, please feel free to email me or send me a message through or a tweet. So you have my contact information on the bottom left. So thank you very much and have a good day.